The human brain evolved under a single, unchanging condition, Earth. Every neural circuit that governs balance, perception, emotion, and memory was shaped by gravity pulling downward, by a sky that moves predictably, by days and nights cycling every 24 hours. Spaceflight breaks that continuity instantly. The moment the body enters orbit, the brain is forced into an environment it was never designed to interpret. In microgravity, the vestibular system, structures in the inner ear that detect motion and orientation, loses its most fundamental reference point. On Earth, gravity provides a constant signal. In orbit, that signal disappears. The brain continues to receive information from the eyes and muscles, but it no longer matches what the inner ear reports. The result is sensory conflict. For many astronauts, this manifests as space motion sickness, disorientation, and nausea during the first days in orbit. But beneath these acute symptoms lies something more fundamental. The brain is forced to rewrite how it understands the body's position in space. Neuroimaging studies of astronauts before and after missions show measurable changes in brain structure even after relatively short stays. Fluid shifts upward in the body, altering intracranial pressure. Cerebrospinal fluid redistributes, subtly changing the shape and position of brain tissue. These are not abstract effects. They correlate with changes in spatial awareness, eye movement control, and reaction time. The brain adapts because it must, but adaptation comes at a cost. On Earth, the brain constantly predicts sensory input. It expects how the world should behave and compares that expectation with reality. In space, prediction fails repeatedly. Up becomes meaningless. Movement no longer follows learned rules. Objects float, bodies rotate without resistance, and the simplest actions require conscious correction. The brain is pushed into a state of persistent recalibration. This recalibration demands cognitive resources. Tasks that are automatic on Earth become deliberate. Astronauts report that routine activities require more focus, especially in the early phase of missions. The brain is not malfunctioning. It is reallocating attention to maintain performance under unfamiliar constraints. Yet this constant vigilance increases mental load. Time perception is also affected. Without consistent environmental cues, no weather, no natural horizon, no gravity-driven motion, the brain loses external anchors for timekeeping. Artificial schedules replace biological rhythms, but the internal sense of time becomes less stable. This is not immediately debilitating, but it establishes the first fracture between human neurobiology and the environment of space. At this stage, the changes are mostly adaptive and reversible. The brain is strained, but it compensates. However, this initial departure from Earth is not a temporary inconvenience. It is the first step in a cascade. The longer the brain remains in an environment that contradicts its evolutionary design, the more those compensations harden into structural and functional change. Space does not assault the brain with violence. It does something more subtle. It removes the assumptions on which the brain depends. And once those assumptions are gone, every higher mental function, attention, emotion, identity, must operate on unstable ground. Once the brain has adapted to the physics of space, a deeper challenge emerges: isolation. Human cognition is not only shaped by gravity and light, but by other people. Social interaction is a regulatory force on the nervous system. In space, that regulation weakens. Long-duration missions confine astronauts to small, controlled habitats with a limited number of companions. Physical separation from Earth is absolute. Communication delays, even in near-Earth orbit, strip conversations of spontaneity. Facial expressions arrive late. Emotional feedback is flattened. Over time, the brain begins to register this as a social deprivation. Neuroscience shows that prolonged isolation alters activity in regions associated with emotional regulation, including the prefrontal cortex and limbic system. These areas manage impulse control, mood stability, and threat assessment. When social input decreases, the brain compensates by amplifying internal signals. Thoughts become louder. Emotional reactions become more intense relative to external events. Studies conducted in analog environments, such as Antarctic research stations and simulated space habitats, demonstrate consistent cognitive effects. Participants show reduced cognitive flexibility, slower problem solving, and increased irritability over time. These are not failures of character or discipline. They reflect measurable changes in neural processing under sustained isolation. Sleep disruption compounds the problem. In orbit, astronauts experience multiple sunrises and sunsets each day. Artificial lighting attempts to impose a rhythm, but circadian alignment remains imperfect. Chronic circadian misalignment affects neurotransmitter balance, particularly serotonin and dopamine, which are critical for mood and motivation. Over weeks and months, this alters emotional baseline. The brain also responds to isolation by narrowing attention. Under conditions of limited stimulation, neural networks favor efficiency over exploration. This conserves energy but reduces creativity and adaptability. In an environment where unexpected problems can be fatal, this narrowing is not trivial. The brain becomes less tolerant of ambiguity and more reactive to stress. Importantly, these effects do not appear suddenly. They accumulate. Early in a mission, astronauts remain cognitively sharp and emotionally resilient. As time passes, small inefficiencies stack. Emotional recovery slows. Frustration lingers longer. The brain's ability to reset after stress weakens. Technology can mitigate isolation, but it cannot erase it. Video calls, recorded messages, and structured routines provide partial relief, yet they remain simulations of social presence. The brain distinguishes between real-time, embodied interaction, and mediated contact. That distinction matters. Isolation in space is not merely psychological. It is biological. It reshapes how neural circuits process emotion, attention, and stress. These changes are subtle enough to escape casual observation, but significant enough to alter long-term cognitive health. And when isolation intersects with the already altered sensory world of space, the strain on the brain deepens. The human mind is resilient, but it is not infinitely adaptable. Isolation pushes it away from the conditions under which stability evolved, setting the stage for more enduring transformations. On Earth, stress follows a pattern. Threat appears, the nervous system activates, and resolution eventually arrives. In space, stress often lacks closure. The brain remains in a state of low-level activation for extended periods, and that changes how it functions. Spaceflight introduces continuous risk. Equipment failures, radiation exposure, and the impossibility of immediate rescue are ever-present realities. Even when no emergency occurs, the brain is aware that survival depends on flawless execution. This awareness keeps stress response systems partially engaged. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates stress hormones, such as cortisol, is designed for short bursts of activation. Prolonged elevation of cortisol alters neural structure over time. The hippocampus, essential for memory formation and emotional regulation, is particularly sensitive. Chronic stress reduces synaptic density in this region, impairing learning and recall. Astronauts on long missions show changes in stress hormone patterns that persist throughout flight. While these levels may remain within acceptable limits, the absence of true recovery periods matters. The brain does not return fully to baseline. Instead, it adapts to a new normal characterized by heightened vigilance. This constant vigilance affects decision-making. Under sustained stress, the brain prioritizes immediate threats over long-term planning. Neural pathways favor speed over accuracy. This trade-off is useful in emergencies, but costly when maintained indefinitely. Over time, it degrades executive function. Emotionally, chronic stress blunts reward sensitivity. Dopamine signaling becomes less responsive, reducing the sense of satisfaction derived from accomplishment. Tasks are completed, but the emotional payoff diminishes. This contributes to emotional flattening, a state reported by individuals in prolonged high-stress, low-variation environments. The absence of physical stress release exacerbates the problem. On Earth, movement, gravity, and physical exertion help regulate stress hormones. In microgravity, exercise is mandatory but artificial. Muscles work against machines, not against the planet. The sensory feedback is incomplete. The brain registers effort, but not the grounding effects that normally accompany it. Over months, the brain stress systems recalibrate. What once triggered a strong response now produces a muted one, while baseline tension remains elevated. This is not resilience, it is wear. Neural systems lose flexibility. becoming less capable of responding appropriately to new stressors. These changes do not vanish immediately upon return to Earth. Post-mission studies show that some stress-related cognitive effects persist for months. Memory, attention, and emotional regulation gradually recover, but not always fully. The longer the exposure, the slower the recovery. Stress in space is not dramatic or explosive. It is quiet, continuous, and unresolved. It reshapes the brain not through trauma, but through endurance. And endurance has limits. As sensory disruption, isolation, and chronic stress accumulate, they begin to affect something deeper than performance: the sense of self. Identity is not a fixed abstraction. It is maintained by memory, social feedback, and bodily continuity. Space interferes with all three. In microgravity, the body no longer behaves as expected. Posture disappears. Effort feels detached from movement. The brain's internal model of the body, its sense of ownership and position, must be rewritten. Over time, this alters embodied self-perception. Astronauts describe feeling less anchored, as if the boundary between body and environment has softened. Memory also changes under prolonged spaceflight conditions. Stress hormones, sleep disruption, and hippocampal strain affect how experiences are encoded. Memories may become less vivid or more fragmented. Because memory is central to identity continuity, subtle changes in recall can affect how individuals perceive their own narrative. Social identity is equally challenged. Astronauts occupy an unusual psychological position, intensely visible as symbols, yet personally isolated. Feedback from Earth is delayed and filtered. Within the crew, roles are rigid and professional. Opportunities for spontaneous self-expression are limited. Over time, the brain receives fewer signals that reinforce personal identity beyond function. Neuroscience shows that the default mode network, a set of brain regions active during self-reflection, is sensitive to both isolation and stress. Alterations in this network affect introspection and emotional processing. In space, reduced stimulation and high structure can lead to increased rumination or, conversely, emotional withdrawal. Some astronauts report a shift in perspective often described as the overview effect, a profound sense of connection and insignificance when viewing Earth from orbit. While often framed as positive, this experience also reflects a destabilization of scale and self-reference. The brain struggles to integrate the vastness of space with personal identity, and that integration is not always comfortable. These identity-related changes are not pathological, but they are consequential. They reflect a brain operating under conditions where familiar anchors, gravity, society, environment, are absent or distorted. Over long durations, the self becomes more fluid, less reinforced by external structure. Upon return to Earth, reintegration can be challenging. The brain must reverse not only physical adaptations, but cognitive ones. Sensory overload, emotional intensity, and social density can feel overwhelming. Identity, briefly reshaped by space, must settle again into terrestrial constraints. This reshaping is not entirely reversible. Experiences encoded under extreme conditions leave lasting marks. The brain carries traces of altered self-perception forward, even as it readapts. Space does not erase identity, but it stretches it beyond its usual boundaries. Adaptation is often presented as a triumph of human biology. In space, adaptation does occur, but it is not unlimited. Over extended durations, the brain's adjustments begin to drift away from optimal function. Cognitive drift refers to gradual changes in attention, memory, and judgment that accumulate without clear failure points. Reaction times slow slightly. Errors increase marginally. These changes are often small enough to remain within operational limits, yet they reflect a brain operating under sustained compromise. Neural efficiency declines when systems are forced to maintain constant compensation. In space, sensory recalibration, stress regulation, and emotional control all demand ongoing adjustment. This continuous effort reduces cognitive reserve, the brain's capacity to handle additional challenges. Evidence from long-duration missions and analog studies shows that sustained confinement and environmental monotony reduce exploratory thinking. Problem-solving becomes more rigid. The brain favors familiar strategies, even when novel solutions would be more effective. This rigidity increases risk in unpredictable environments. Importantly, these changes do not scale linearly. Short missions produce minimal long-term effects. As duration increases, recovery time lengthens disproportionately. At some point, adaptation transitions into strain. The brain can still function, but with reduced margin for error. Biology imposes constraints that technology cannot fully override. Artificial gravity, improved habitats, and advanced training can reduce stressors, but they cannot replicate Earth's evolutionary context. The brain remains an organ tuned to a planet, not a spacecraft. Radiation exposure further complicates the picture. High-energy particles encountered beyond Earth's magnetosphere can damage neural tissue at the cellular level. While doses are managed carefully, cumulative exposure poses risks to cognitive health, particularly for long missions. Together, these factors define a boundary. The human brain can endure space for months, even years, but not without cost. The longer the exposure, the more adaptation consumes the very systems that enable it. This is not a failure of will or intelligence. It is a reflection of biological design. The brain adapts to survive, but survival is not the same as preservation. Space changes the human mind not through sudden breakdown, but through gradual divergence from the conditions that sustain cognitive stability. Each chapter of exposure builds upon the last, forming a trajectory that cannot be fully reversed. The brain leaves Earth and loses its physical anchors. Isolation alters emotional regulation. Chronic stress reshapes neural structure. Identity becomes fluid. Cognitive reserve erodes. These processes are not speculative. They are grounded in measurable biology. Together, they define a limit. No amount of training can eliminate sensory conflict entirely. No communication system can fully replace social presence. No habitat can recreate the planet that shaped human cognition. The brain can compensate, but compensation is not free. Long-term spaceflight demands trade-offs. The mind remains functional, but less flexible. Capable, but strained. Resilient, but altered. With increasing duration, the cost accumulates faster than recovery can erase it. This does not mean humans cannot go to space. It means space will always exact a neurological price. The question is not whether the brain can adapt, but how much change we are willing to accept as the cost of leaving Earth behind. In the end, space does not defeat the human mind. It reveals its boundaries. And those boundaries are not technological. They are biological, written into neural tissue, shaped by a single world. The farther and longer humans travel from that world, the more the mind must bend. At some point, bending becomes breaking. Not suddenly, but inevitably.